It is 2026. We live in a world of super apps, private space stations, and wealth so concentrated, it's difficult for the human brain to even visualize. Today, the top 0.1% of Americans hold as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. We look at our news feeds and see billionaires influencing elections, buying social media platforms, and shaping global policy with a single post. But if you think this is a new problem, you haven't been looking closely enough at the blueprint of the country. To understand the 2020s, we have to go back to a time before the income tax, a time before the billionaire was even a word. We have to go back to the original era of the private empire. This was the Gilded Age, a period of American history that was so shiny, so golden, and so innovative on the outside that almost nobody noticed the floorboards were rotting underneath. We are talking about the American dream you read about in history books. We're talking about the moment the American government was treated like a distressed asset and bought at a discount. Imagine it's 1893. You're standing in the middle of the Chicago World's Fair. They call it the White City. For the first time in human history, night was turned into day by thousands of Westinghouse electric bulbs. People saw the first moving walkway, the first Ferris wheel, and a vision of a future where technology would solve every human problem. But Mark Twain saw through it. He's the one who gave this era its name, the Gilded Age. Gilded doesn't mean solid gold. It means a cheap piece of iron covered in a microscopic layer of gold leaf. Twain knew that while the White City was glowing, the real cities, New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, were choking. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, the density was higher than in the worst slums of Bombay. While the wealthy were throwing gilded parties where they fed their dogs off silver platters, 25% of children in the city were dying before their first birthday. Beneath that polished image, ordinary workers lived in poverty. Immigrants crowded into dirty urban neighborhoods, laborers worked long hours in dangerous factories, and politicians often sold access to the highest bidder. This was not just an age of growth, it was an age of imbalance, and the men at the top knew exactly how to use it. The stars of this era were the men later called the robberbarons. Names like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and jpmorgan became symbols of immense wealth and private power. Britannica notes that these industrialists built fortunes in oil, steel, railroads, banking, and transportation, often through monopolies, ruthless tactics, and the crushing of competitors. John D. Rockefeller didn't just like oil, he obsessed over it. But his real genius wasn't in drilling, it was in the squeeze. By the 1870s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of the refineries in America. He didn't just build a better product, he built a better backroom deal. Rockefeller went to the railroad kings, Vanderbilt and Scott, and made a secret pact. It was called the South Improvement Company. The railroads would charge everyone a high price to ship oil, but they gave Rockefeller a secret discount. Then, the railroads took a portion of the extra money they charged Rockefeller's competitors and gave it directly to Rockefeller. Imagine trying to run a lemonade stand, but every time your neighbor sells a cup, the city takes 50 cents and gives it to you. That's not capitalism. That's a capture. Rockefeller once said, "The day of individual effort is gone," and he was right. And he wasn't alone. While Rockefeller owned the light, Andrew Carnegie owned the skeleton of the country, steel. Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who worked his way up, but once he reached the top, he pulled the ladder up behind him. He vertically integrated everything. He owned the iron mines, the ships that carried the ore, the furnaces that smelled the steel, and the railroads that shipped it. If you wanted to build a skyscraper in 1890, you paid Andrew Carnegie. If you wanted to move goods, you paid Vanderbilt or Morgan. These men weren't just rich. They were more powerful than the governors of the states they operated in, and they were about to prove it. In a democracy, the government is supposed to be the referee, but in the 1880s, the referee was on the payroll. Take the Credit Mobilier scandal. This was the greatest heist in American history up to that point. The directors of the Union Pacific Railroad created the fake construction company. They billed the U.S. government for $94 million for work that actually cost $50 million. They essentially stole $44 million of taxpayers' money. When Congress started to investigate, the company didn't hide. They just gave key congressmen shares of stocks in the company. The Senate back then wasn't even elected by the people. They were chosen by state legislatures, which were easily bought by corporate lobbyists. This was the Millionaires Club. But the corruption went all the way to the streets. In New York, Tammany Hall and wallstreet ran the city like a mafia. They used honest graft. George Washington Plunkett, a Tammany leader, famously explained it like this: "I see my opportunity and I take it. If a city is going to build a park, I buy the land nearby first. Is that a crime? No, that's just being smart." By the time the public realized what was happening, the billionaires and the machines had woven themselves into the very fabric of the law. If a law was passed that threatened the monopoly, the Supreme Court, filled with former corporate lawyers, simply struck it down. The government had become a service provider for the elite. When you buy the government, you also buy the monopoly on violence. In 1892, at Carnegie's Homestead steel plant, workers went on strike. They weren't asking for much, just a living wage and a safe place to work. Carnegie's manager, Henry Clay Frick, responded by building a 12-foot wall around the plant topped with barbed wire. He called it Fort Frick. Frick hired the Pinkertons, a private mercenary army. They arrived on barges at night and guns were drawn. A literal war broke out on the banks of the river. 9 workers were killed. But here's the capture in its purest form. When the Pinkertons were defeated by the workers, the governor of Pennsylvania didn't arrest Frick for hiring mercenaries. He sent in 8,000 state militia troops to crash the strike and protect the scabs. 2 years later, during the Pullman strike, President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops because the strike was interfering with the mail. The message to every American was loud and clear. If you are a billionaire, the army is your security guard. If you are a worker, the army is your jailer. This was the peak of the Gilded Age. A billionaire hadn't just bought the policy, they had bought the physical power of the state. Eventually, the bubble burst. The people had enough. The backcrackers exposed the filth. Teddy Roosevelt used the big stick to break the trusts. The Gilded Age ended. And so we were told. But look at 2026. The names have changed from Rockefeller and Carnegie to names like Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg. But the mechanics are eerily the same. We see dark money in our elections. We see regulatory capture where the people running the agencies are the very same people who used to ruin the corporations. we see a world where a single billionaire can decide to turn off satellite internet for a country at war, or decide which political voices get amplified to billions of people. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The Gilded Age taught us that when the line between private wealth and public power disappears, democracy becomes an illusion. We are living in the second Gilded Age. The question is no longer whether the billionaires have bought the government. The question is, are we going to let them keep the receipt?